So welcome everyone to today's seminar, actually the last one in this quarter. We will have another great one coming quarter. We already have lined up all the speakers. So there's this poster here which you will find also at the end of the room. So pick one up, distribute wherever you can, so we get a great turnout next quarter. Okay, so it's a pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Colin Campbell, who grew up originally in the UK and then came to the US a couple of years ago. And he is a senior reporter at Polygon, which is a website that provides news, culture, reviews, and also videos about video games in general. And he has actually been reporting on video games since the 1980s, so he's been around for a long time. And so fittingly, he also got in 2011 an award, namely the Games in Media Legend Award. Besides his professional work on writing games, he's also writing novels. One of them is called Piranha Frenzy, which deals with corruption in games journalism, and so which kind of also I think is a nice lead-in into today's talk and its topic. And so without further ado, welcome, Colin.
So as you said, my name is Colin Campbell. I work for Polygon. It's owned by Vox Media, which also publishes The Verge, Vox, SB Nation, and those sorts of websites that you might be familiar with. I've been writing about video games for a while now, and I want to talk today about the connection between video games, politics, and the media. For a long time, by politics, I don't mean presidential elections or international affairs. I just mean the place of the individual in the world, the individual's view of the world, and how they can change it personally through art, through media. My central point, I suppose, is to show that for a very long time, video games have had almost nothing to say about the individual, but in the last few years, that has changed enormously. Video games now are saying a great deal about the individual, about society, and that has had some unexpected repercussions, which I hope to investigate. I think this is a movement that we're going to see more and more of in the years ahead. So I'm going to talk about myself for a slightly extended period because I wanted to sort of cast a light on how the video games media sort of was born and where it came from and where it's come to now. I'm one of a tiny, tiny number of people who were paid to write about video games in the 1980s and are still doing so today. Actually, I met the only other person that I know who's still doing this. He also is from Britain. He also lives in the Bay Area. And we met at an Xbox event a few weeks ago, and we were both like, people are still paying us to do this job because it's kind of an idiotic way to make a living. I sit at home, I play video games, I talk to people who play video games, and people pay me money to do that. And they have been doing so for the last 30 years or so. It does sound like a dream job. I get it all the time, like the barber or whatever. Really, you play video games? But even though it is an attractive way to make a living, it does have its downsides. For one, it doesn't pay very well. And it's a lot harder work than it looks. There's a lot of travel involved, a lot of late nights. If you're reviewing a game, you've got to finish it before you write about it, and sometimes that can be an extremely frustrating experience. And also, it's sort of annoying because people deny that it's journalism at all. They'll say, how can writing about video games be counted as journalism alongside somebody who's in a foxhole in a war zone, or somebody who's exposing the corruption of politicians? And they've got a fair point. It's not journalism in that sense, but it's journalism in the sense of we're writing about something that is important to our culture now, that is changing rapidly, and that is important to individual people, and very important to individual people. A lot of people in games journalism, though, tend to drift off. They'll go off into other journalism verticals, or they'll go off into management, or they'll get a job in PR working in the games industry, which is a general route that people go through. I want to talk about how I got started in games journalism. When I was a boy, the Atari VCS came along, and Pong and all that jazz, and I played those things like all other boys and some girls at that time. And when I talk to game developers today, they always have the same sort of narrative, which is the first time I saw a Mac II, or an Apple II, or a Sinclair Spectrum, I was in love, and all I wanted to do was program. I didn't feel that at all. Computers were totally alien to me. I had no great interest in them. I was amazed that you could waggle a joystick and things would happen on the screen, but it didn't charm me in the same way that it's charmed people who've gone on to make games. But what I did love were arcades and arcade machines, and I played, all the greats like Space Invaders and Galaxians, and this one, which I love. There is still a Defender where I live in Santa Cruz on the boardwalk, which you can go down and play. This is still, in my opinion, one of the top 3 video games of all time. I absolutely love it, although I'm not nearly as good as I was 30 years ago. The places where we'd play those video games were sort of CD chip shops, taxi ranks, and there was a sort of separate culture from the kind of home computer crowd who were figuring out how to program and how to create new worlds. But I spent my last year in school in England at that time. The minimum age for leaving was 15, and I spent that year playing Frogger in a laundrette. The tutors at my school weren't particularly impressed with that. They declined to invite me to carry on with further education, and I went out to get a job. I wanted to work in journalism. I wanted to get a job as a reporter. And in those days, you didn't have to go to university necessarily to get a job in journalism. If you could write a press release and make tea and not complain about it, then you could get a job. So I tried to get jobs on local newspapers and dry periodicals, and I didn't have any luck at all. But I finally got a job on a little weekly newspaper that got sent out to all the little mom and pop stores that were selling computers and computer games and computer software, and it was called Computer Trade Weekly, and they let me in because I sat in the interview and talked about Defender and Frogger and how I knew all these games, and they were like, yeah, fine, come on in. So that was my start in journalism. I knew nothing about what I was writing about. I remember the first job I was given was to write about a bunch of companies who were exhibiting at a big trade convention in London. It was like, find out what they're doing and write about it. So they gave me a list, and I got on the phone. And this is the days of typewriters and dial phones and galleys and all that stuff. And I started with I called up a company called Amstrad, big company in England. They made hi-fis. And I said, oh, hey, Mr. PR person, what are you doing at this big show? And they said, oh, we're going to be launching a thing called the PC 1512. So my first question in games journalism was, what is a PC? I had absolutely no idea what I was writing about. But I'd sort of managed to stumble into the biggest growth area in the history of the magazine business, which was computer and computer games magazines in the 1980s and the 1990s. These things in those days, some of you will remember, were as fat as telephone books. The magazines were bringing in advertising at maybe $1,000 a page. This is in the UK, much, much more in the US. They were 65% advertising, and people like me were paid to fill up the other 35% of the magazines. And you'll remember quite a lot of those PC magazines back in those days would have a video game section sort of in the back or in the middle. And that soon spun out into their own magazines. This was the era of wonderful computers like the Atari ST, the Commodore Amiga, and of course IBM compatible PCs, as well as games consoles like the Nintendo and the Mega Drive, Genesis. For me, though, in those first few days, I just saw it as a stepping stone. I just wanted to write about something interesting, like movies or sports, music. But I soon figured out that actually video games are in and of themselves a really interesting thing to write about. They're created by interesting, fascinating, driven people. They're part of a rapidly evolving technology. They're artistic and creative and visual. But most importantly of all, they're always about something else, always. So it doesn't matter whether that's sports or war or falling bricks or mushroom kingdoms. They're always about something else. And so you sort of use them as an outlet to talk about bigger issues. So games, for me, were always great for writing about other things as well. I mean, I love the games themselves, and I came to love playing with them and playing with computer games. But one of the things that games, and I didn't write about in those days, was anything sort of political or dangerous or interesting outside of the kind of fantasy worlds that games inhabited. And I want to kind of address that failure now at a time when those things are being addressed, because this is a long period of time. We're talking about 1980, 81, through to about 2010, when video games journalism did not talk about anything other than video games in a very narrow sense. I remember in the late 80s, I worked for a computer magazine, and I wanted to write a story about how computers were being used by the British government to sort of spy on, for want of a better word, to spy on people in West Belfast. This was the time of the Troubles, and I had a personal interest in it. My family are from Belfast, so I called up people on the Falls Road, and I called up Sinn Féin, and I called up the British government, and to talk about how computers were being used. And I took the story to my bosses, and they almost crapped themselves. They were just like, there's just no way we're running this story. And they couched it in, this isn't really right for our audience, but really it was sort of editorial cowardice. The way they saw it was, what we do is advise consumers about things to buy and things not to buy. This game is awesome, you should buy it. This game is terrible, you should avoid it. We were basically consumer guides, we were reviewers rather than being critics. And there were some exceptions. There were like consumer-focused reports on the price of games, or whether piracy is a good or a bad thing, or whether DLC should come out a month after a game or a year after a game. Those sorts of consumer fandom concerns. But the fact of the matter is that at a time when magazines like Rolling Stone and NME and music magazines were quite comfortable talking about music and cinema and art in a wider context of the culture that they were inside, we weren't comfortable with that at all, and we just never really went there. And we were much more like, I don't know, gardening magazines or car magazines than we were about magazines that addressed the culture that we were a part of. And I think it was a failure on our part. We saw games as being just simply this hobby. But it didn't help that games on the whole were ostensibly apolitical. The idea of a games publisher during the 80s or the 90s releasing a game protesting against, say, apartheid was just unthinkable. They were too busy making games about mascots jumping around platforms and simulations of shooting games and all that stuff. So they had no interest in games that said anything interesting. So this is an exception. This is a game called Deus Ex Machina, which came out in the late 80s on the Sinclair Spectrum, and it was made by a team in England that were very well known, very successful, but this game kind of broke them. Now, this was a game that was all about the human experience, all about going through life, the 7 ages of man and all that stuff, and it was a marvelous piece of philosophical multimedia, and it got a lot of coverage in the games media, and it completely failed. It died a death. And it still today is a kind of like emblematic of the interest that consumers had in those days, really in just shooting stuff and not in anything that was anything more sophisticated than that. The games consumers in those days were basically boys or young men in their teenage years, and their interests were extremely narrow. But all games are political insofar as they represent the sort of prejudices and the worldviews of their makers. If you look at the games were made, generally speaking, by young white men. The games were consumed, generally speaking, by young men. The games were written about by young men. And women in these games were almost always treated as garlands or decorations, or perhaps as victims. People of colour were always villains or comic relief. And I think as journalists at the time, well, I can't speak for other journalists, but for me at the time, it was a sort of, I recognised it, but only in a sort of eye-rolly, oh, here we go again, writing about Middle Eastern bad guys or whatever. But there was never any attempt to say, hang on, this is not quite right. And I suppose that is really what privilege looks like. Games are all, when I think about one of my favourite games, which is Civilization, you look at the Civilization series of games, just wonderful. But you think about that game, what it says is that in order to create a civilization, you need to create lots of military units, you need to expand, you need to conquer your neighbours. And, is that really the definition of civilization? Probably not. I was reading an article recently about SimCity and how that game was made, here in Silicon Valley, and it's essentially an argument for low taxation and leave the individual alone and small government and all that sort of stuff. So I think now, if I could go back in time and be a little bit more proactive about writing about these issues, wouldn't it be marvellous if I was sort of 10 times smarter and 10 times bolder than I actually am? But there's a part of me that thinks, well, it's a bit like that Belfast story. I'd go to the bosses and I'd say, here's an interesting perspective on games, and they'd be like, that's just not who we are. And it's still going on. I mean, I wrote for a big website, not Polygon, in about 2011, and I wrote a story about how women are bullied shockingly in online games. They go play these online games, and if they reveal themselves to be women, they get all sorts of appalling treatment. And the editor was just like, we're not running this. This is all played out, this story. But it wasn't all played out. It was an essential story that needed to be told, and kind of was told in the mainstream a couple of years later. But I think there's a sense of caution and perhaps cowardice that was going on at that time. Thankfully, that is changing. There are young journalists today who've been brought up with games around them as just simply part of the culture they live in, and they're comfortable drawing lines between human behaviour and the activities, the society that they see around them, and the entertainment that we produce, whether that is, or that we consume, whether that is music or movies or video games. Obviously, video games is where it's really happening right now. It's the most interesting art form because it's the one that is changing the most, and it's the one that people are most sort of connected to through their lives. There is now a demand for analysis like Feminist Frequency, which is, I think, absolutely marvellous. She's brought feminist learning from places like this into games criticism, and so that, even though for years and years people might have talked about a crappy way that women were portrayed in video games, now we're hearing the arguments in a convincing and erudite way that we weren't hearing about before. And there are other commentators and journalists who are coming forward and talking about LGBT issues and race and economic distribution, gun laws, so on and so forth, and we're going to see more and more of that. But what's most interesting, I think, is that games writing and games journalism has become more political at the same time that games have become more political, and I think that a lot of the sort of force and power of this stuff is coming from the people who actually make games. And I just want to spend 5 minutes or so just talking about a few of those games, and I apologise if you're super familiar with these. This is Life is Strange, and all it is a game about two young women who are pals, and it's about the intensity of their relationship. Quite often people of this age have intense relationships, and they spend a lot of time on screen just talking to each other. And the game itself is a sort of telltale style series of dialogue trees, some time travel based puzzles, but that's not what's interesting about it. What's interesting and political about it is that it's about young women. Now, if you had a movie or a television show about two young women being pals, nobody would really be that interested, or if there was a book, but because it's a game, that's what's interesting about it. And a lot of people are talking about it as if this is something amazing, a game about young women. Personally, I actually love this game, but I think there was a lot of things wrong with it. It was all too obviously made by men, in my opinion. They idealised the characters too much, but still a step forward. This is Tacoma. It is made by the people who made Gone Home. I don't know if you played that game. It's a marvellous game set in the 1990s. The pedigree of the developers is enough reason to talk about it. It's set in a space station in like 2085. That's not interesting. What's interesting is it's about what happens when people who are from very different backgrounds, who have very different perspectives and ideals, are put together in a small space and they come up against each other. And when you put a pressure on that, then sparks start to fly. And I can't think of anything that's more political than that. You turn on CNN tonight, and that's essentially what they're going to be talking about. This is a story that I wrote about an organisation which wants to publicise the danger of nuclear weapons. Where are these things and who's looking after them and what's going to happen if something goes wrong? An excellent question. And rather than going onto YouTube or handing out leaflets, they're saying, let's find somebody, let's have a contest, let's find somebody to write a game that's going to speak to this issue. So political organisations are coming to video games and spreading their message through the format of video games, because I think, and I'm sure some of the people who've come here to talk before me, they have a special sort of power to get messages across. You're inside the experience, you're making the decisions that people who might be in these positions of power are expected to make. This is Final Girls, and I really love this project because it was written by a woman who'd suffered from abuse. She'd gone through the process of recovery groups. She wanted to talk about how recovery groups work, how women talk to each other in these situations and how they get through it. And it's based roughly on fictional women who survived horror movies and science fiction movies. The last woman to survive. It's funny, it's quirky, and it's powerful, and a lot of games are doing that. But these are examples of, I think, games that have positive messages about how the world can be a better place, how we can help people through video games. But there are also other games that have negative connotations and negative politics. This is a game called Hatred, and it's about a man who despises humanity and decides he's going to run around and just shoot everybody. It doesn't matter who they are, and it's a sort of mass murder simulation. This is the headline that I wrote at the time. I thought it was appalling. It didn't surprise me at all to find out that the people who were running it had links to far-right organisations. But the game got a lot of support. There are a lot of people out there who are, thank God, something that isn't politically correct, something that tells it as it is. So I just wanted to show that game because it shows the division between the video games are speaking to all corners of the political spectrum. So now I want to talk about how the games industry itself is set up in a kind of political way. And if you can imagine, of course you can imagine, but a square with these sort of four corners that come together in the middle. First, there's the big old game companies, and these are inherently conservative. I don't mean they're worried about Planned Parenthood or big government. They're conservative in the sense that they don't want anything to change in terms of the culture that we live in. Any kind of change is bad for their business. They're planning 3 to 5 years ahead, and all their business is predicated on what people like, what they enjoy, what they consume. If you can imagine, say, American football, the NFL, declining in popularity over the next few years, that would be a catastrophe for a company like Electronic Arts, which is heavily invested in football, in Madden, its Madden franchise in the NFL. And every year, I don't particularly care about American football, but every year when the Madden ad comes out in August, I'm always kind of excited about it because the ads are slick and they're funny and people talk about them on social media. They're not just advertising Madden games, which I'll never play. They're advertising the NFL. They're advertising the continuation of the culture that we live in. And the same goes for like shooting games. If shooting games suddenly tomorrow were seen as the childish toys of man boys, man babies, then that would be a catastrophe for Activision, and they make sure that doesn't happen through their advertising. And it's no surprise to find out that Activision is run by an advertising guy. So their political caution obviously favours the status quo. They only change things when pressure is put upon them by consumers and by the media. And we're starting to see that at the moment, where for the first time we're seeing female characters, women characters who are lead characters, who have power, who are not just simply there as sex symbols. This is something that wasn't happening even 5-6 years ago. And these companies turn up at big trade shows like E3, and they show their game, and somebody will say, well, where is the female lead option in this game? And they're sort of shamefacedly saying, well, we didn't actually think of that. And they're starting to create dynamics where you can play as a woman in a game, or the woman leading the game has a certain amount of power. You look at the way Lara Croft was in the 90s and the way that she is now, where she is an actual human being who grows and has emotions and has power. That's a really interesting change from where we went from before. But it didn't really come from within. I think it came from outside those organisations. At the other end of the spectrum, you have indie developers. And these are individuals or small teams who have a vision for a kind of a game that they want to create. Usually, it could be just a puzzle game or whatever, and they're looking to make their way in the world, they're looking to make money, but some of them are making games that represent themselves, represent their ideals, represent their personality or their particular place in the world, which is not the same as traditional game developers. And they are progressive in the sense that they're saying, the world as it is not to my satisfaction. Here is a game that is arguing for a change in the world as it is, or at least here is a game that shows you how my life is different from your life. And I think these games are vastly more influential than their sales numbers. There's just a list of them here. I'm not going to go through all of them. You may have come across them in talks like this before. But they have opinions. And these games' opinions are not necessarily complimentary about the status quo. And they raise issues. They get people's hackles up, or they get people saying, yeah, I agree with this. They are talking points. And these games are coming out of a changing in the people who are actually playing games. People who are brought up playing games, who aren't those sort of lads who were playing games in the 80s and 90s. This is 2016, and they're saying, I want to use this as a platform to talk about myself and to talk about my place in the world, or to talk about problems in the world, like homelessness, for example, in Cart Life, or the plight of people in war zones in this war of mine. That's a game where you are basically trying to survive. You're not like this mighty warrior. You're just somebody who's starving to death, who's sick, and who's living in a war zone. It's extraordinary. Independent game. Indies are independent, but more than that, they are individuals, and I admire them because they're projecting themselves into the art that they create in a way that just hasn't happened before. And so this takes us to the third part of it, which is the media, which is where I work. The media is not part of the games industry. It's its own business. It's not there to sell video games or to project how awesome the video game industry is. We do that to a certain extent, but it's not really our role. Our role is to create audience, and by creating an audience, we create advertising revenue. It's as simple as that. Some journalists will run stories, and you've probably seen them along the lines of, 20 games that will make you wet yourself, and those stories will get plenty of traffic. And other journalists will run stories where they sit down with creators and they're interested in talking about the game's place in the culture. Generally speaking, most websites will do a bit of both. Certainly Polygon, we don't do stories about people wetting themselves, but we do stories that are populistic and those that are relevant to the culture. And even in my career, I've certainly churned out my fair share of rubbish. There are journalists out there who represent the kind of preview, review, let's play treadmill that has been a part of the games industry for a really long time, which is big companies turn up with their PR people, they show you the game, you write about it, you review it, you talk about how great it is. But more and more, we're seeing game writers who are interested in talking about games and their impact on the culture. Now, when I get a game that talks about some particular aspect of the world, like homelessness, for example, I'm interested in writing about it. I'm interested in writing why the person who made the game wanted to make that particular point. These make really good stories, and they generate opinions. And the opinion that often comes out from the media is, let's have more games like this, because it's different from all the other stuff, the space warriors running around squishing aliens that we've been playing for a long time. Those games are fine, but here's something that actually has something interesting to say about the world. And so these media outlets are sort of saying, let's have more of this. And it starts to look like campaigning journalism. It is progressive in the sense that it's saying we want change. We want more things that represent change, that are looking for change. And there are plenty of journalists in games journalism, as in all areas of journalism, who are kind of blindly propagating conservative ideas that are handed down to them by vested interests like publishers, and they have a lot of self-sustaining power. But as these new perspectives gain ground, they start to take root, and the media is kind of taking these great ideas from independent developers and sort of carrying them over to consumers. Consumers are saying, "Wait, this is new, this is different. This speaks to me in a way that hasn't been spoken to me before," and so it kind of grows within games journalism, and it's a representation of this is the fourth political part of the games industry, which is consumers. And consumers are changing, enormously. What they want is changing enormously. A few years ago, sometimes consumers would be very vocal about, say, downloadable content. Why isn't this part of the game itself? Why am I paying extra for it? Why do games cost $60? How is it that the creator has the final say about how these characters that I care about die or live or whatever? But these are consumer fandom concerns, and if you can call them politics at all, they're very much at the outer edges of politics. And I think in the last 3 years, we have seen an enormous change come over the shape and the tone of the debates coming from consumers. Now, there's only one political movement that's ever come out of, or with a name that's ever come out of games consumers, and it's called Gamergate, and you've probably heard about it. It is a ferocious reaction to all the stuff that I've been talking about here today, the sort of widening of the demographic of people who play video games, of how video games address the world, of how writers like me write about the world. It sees this change as a threat to their status quo, their position as the consumer that is most slavishly marketed to and seen to by the games companies. And their version, their narrative of how what's happening here is a conspiracy. That the conspiracy is that progressives, feminists, for example, are coming into games from the outside and are saying, you know, we're going to change video games and we're going to make them reflect our ideals, and that reporters, journalists, the games media are in cahoots with this conspiracy and have been corrupted by this conspiracy. Now, as I've said, the media definitely covers progressive games because they're interesting, because they're from interesting people, because they have interesting things to say. But, you know, we still cover games about running around shooting people. We still cover Madden. We still cover cute platform games. But for them, their belief is that the media is motivated by political bias and they're inherently corrupt. Now, the sordid details of where Gamergate came from, I'm not going to go into that here, but when you look it up on Wikipedia, or if you're familiar with it, you'll understand where it's really coming from. And their distrust of the media is at least equal to, but probably not equal to, the loathing that they have for anything that seems progressive, that for anything that address, say, feminism or race or economic disparity. They just despise all that stuff. It's interesting that Gamergate quickly attracted some culture warriors from the right. There's the irony, is that these people who hadn't really been interested in video games at any point up to this point were suddenly super interested in video games and the rights of Gamergaters to play the games that they'd always played and just the games that they'd always played, and there was no reason for games to change at all. There were some tactics like online abuse, doxing, and even death threats, and these were tactics that were picked up by the mainstream media. And it's interesting that the mainstream media saw this for what it was, which was a large number of misogynists bullying a small number of creative women who were just trying to create art. And it's even this week they're harassing a woman at Nintendo over God knows what crime that she has apparently committed. But it's identity politics for the first time coming out of games or being transposed onto games. It's a reaction from these lads who have always been catered to by the games industry and who've always been told you're the only people that really matter to the games companies, and suddenly that's just not the case anymore. Games are, to put it in the most kind of crassly pat terms, games are for everybody now. And it's been around for a really long time. I mean, under the surface. I can remember sitting in meetings, there was a game that came out and it talked about, it was about gods. You could play as a god and you could run around as these gods. And it picked up it portrayed Hindu gods and goddesses, as well as sort of Nordic gods and goddesses and those sort of dead religions. And didn't make fun of them, but sort of made light of them. But there was no sign of any Christian icons or Islamic icons. And some Hindus were like, this is outrageous, this is wrong. And I made the same point. But there were people in the editorial meetings where I was working saying, what is the problem here? They're just games, they're not important, it doesn't matter. Well, they're not just games. They do have a political edge to them. All games have a political edge to them, and that is now being reflected. And I think Gamergate, in my personal opinion, is starting to dissipate. It is starting to go away. Obviously, there's always going to be a hardcore, but the real power is, and I think they've already sort of lost, for want of a better word, the real power is in the changing face of games consumers, in their demand for games that speak to the world that they want to see and that speak to the emotions that they want to feel. Games now are not just like gardening or, fixing cars. It's not just something you go out and do. They are part of the culture that we live in, and arguably they are the most important part of the culture that we live in, because games are going to be a huge part of how we communicate with each other, how we learn from each other, as well as how we entertain each other. So I'm going to start to wrap up now. what's interesting for me is that the catalyst for all this is actually a really small number of people making a small number of games that are played by a relatively small number of people. But they have a massive influence on consumer views, on the media, and even on games publishers. You know, that Life is Strange game that I showed you earlier is published by a big Japanese, very conservative company. Nintendo has introduced a female version of Link, not a very good one. You know, she's got a ponytail and she's got a dress, but still, it's a very conservative company saying there's a problem here and we need to do something about it. To get it into context, this game, Depression Quest, sold maybe 1 million copies for an independent game. That is an extraordinary achievement, but still, 1 million copies, when you put it next to Grand Theft Auto 5, which has sold, I'm guessing, 40 million copies, is small beer. But they're both political games in their own right. One of them, Depression Quests, says, this is what it's like to be a human being. This is what it's like to suffer from depression. This is what you might not understand about it when you say, hey, cheer up, what's the problem? This is a game that if you've never suffered from depression and you played this game, you would understand what it means to suffer from depression. Whereas Grand Theft Auto is a political game in the sense that it makes fun of urban politics and modern America. It doesn't have anything to say apart from, you know, haha, look at these dumb people, now you can go and shoot them. And I think I'm much more interested in seeing what happens with these sorts of games like Depression Quests than in these sort of grotesque simulations of the world. Games are not a new media. Now, they've been around for 40 odd years. They've been around all my life. And it did not take decades for the printed word or for movies to start becoming political. Books were political from day one. Movies got political within the first few years. And yet only now we're seeing games get political. But I think the fact is that the printed book just came out of speaking, and movies came out of theatres, which have been around. Both of those things have been around forever, whereas games just came out of nothing. You know, they came out of oscilloscopes, and it's a technology on which it has taken us, or game developers, a long time to project themselves and their ideas onto. And I think it's a very difficult thing to create a game where you're wandering around and you're interacting with things, and to have that say something. It takes a lot of skill, and most of the time I think game developers fail when they try to do it, but those that succeed, I think, succeed very well. You know, we're getting there. I've been writing about games, as I say, for 30 years. This is by far the most interesting period of the games industry, because finally games are saying something. They're saying the world can change, we can change the world, and you know, here is a perspective that you might not have thought about before. Now, it's interesting that games in the past have always put you in the shoes of somebody else, and generally that somebody else is somebody powerful. You can fly, you can shoot foreigners, you can do things that are powerful. But games now are putting you in the shoes of somebody who is vulnerable. What is it like to be grossly overweight? Or what is it like to be in a wheelchair? What is it like to be in a refugee camp? Now, these are interesting questions that you could find out from reading somebody's memoirs, or you could find out from going to look on the television. But how amazing is it to find out through playing as that person? And with the coming of virtual reality and that kind of all-encompassing technology, I think we're going to see this more and more in the future. And that is it from me. This is my contact information, and you can get hold of me if you want.